The horse came back without her husband. Lenora Crane recognized the animal from 200 yards, a gray gelding named Patch for the brown smear across his left shoulder, 16 years old and steady as courthouse stone, the kind of horse that did not spook and did not run, and had not once in 6 years of working that Wyoming Clem returned to the barn without the man who rode him out. She was standing at the cabin door with a flour sack in her hands when Patch came through the tree line at a loose trot, reins trailing, stirrups empty, and stopped at the fence gate the way he always stopped and waited to be let through. Thomas Crane had been dead for 3 hours by then. His body was found the following spring by a trapper working the upper Absaroka drainage, a fall from a limestone shelf above the creek, a single bad step on frost-slicked rock in the gray light of an October morning. Quick and without drama, the way deaths on the frontier frequently were. But Lenora did not know any of that yet. She knew only that the horse had come back alone, and that the sky above the Absaroka Range had turned the specific color of old pewter that meant serious weather was building in the high country. She went inside and sat down at the table and did not move for 20 minutes. Then Thomas's brother arrived. Clem Crane was 38 years old, narrow through the chest, with the particular confidence of a man who has been waiting for an opportunity and has just watched it arrive. He had ridden from his own claim 6 miles south the moment a passing rider told him about the horse, and he came through Lenora's door without knocking, and stood in the center of the room and told her what was going to happen. The claim was in Thomas's name. Clem was Thomas's only living male relative. Under territorial inheritance custom as Clem understood and explained it, standing in his dead brother's cabin with his hat still on his head, the claim passed to him. Lenora could remain through the winter as a courtesy if she made herself useful. Come spring, she would need to make other arrangements. Lenora was 32 years old. She had no money. She had no family within 400 miles. She had a working knowledge of the Absaroka Range that she had built over 6 years of living in it, a skinning knife with a 4-inch blade, a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver with 11 rounds, a wool blanket, and a cast-iron pot. She also had 3 days. Not because Clem gave her 3 days out of generosity, because the weather gave them both 3 days before it closed the passes, and Clem had enough sense to understand that a woman dying on his claim in an October storm was a complication he did not need. He told her she could take what she could carry and leave before the snow came. He said this while already moving her things toward the door. She packed in 40 minutes. The wool blanket she rolled tight and tied across her back with a length of rope. The cast-iron pot she hung from her belt on a leather strap, the weight of it pulling at her left hip with every step. The revolver went into her coat pocket, the skinning knife into the sheath on her belt. She took the full bag of dried corn, a partial sack of salt, a small tin of lard, a coil of snare wire she found in Thomas's tool chest, and the flint and steel kit from the shelf above the stove. She took the steel-headed hatchet from the barn wall and carried it in her right hand. She did not look back at the cabin when she left. She walked northeast into the Absaroka foothills because northeast was the direction she knew best, and because northeast was away from Clem and away from the main trail where she had no interest in being seen by anyone who might carry word back to him. The foothills rose in long, broken ridges above the Wyoming basin floor, covered in lodgepole pine and Douglas fir that thickened as the elevation climbed, the ground beneath them soft with decades of needle duff that absorbed her footsteps and held no trail. She had been walking for 2 hours when she remembered the cave. It was not a cave she had discovered. Thomas had shown it to her in their second summer on the claim, during a long-ranging ride into the upper drainage that had taken them further into the Absaroka than they usually went. A sandstone alcove, he had called it, though it was larger than that word suggested. A horizontal split in the cliff face above Needle Creek, accessible by a ledge traverse that required care but not technical climbing, sheltered from north and west winds by the cliff's natural angle, with a south-facing opening that caught whatever winter sun cleared the ridgeline. Thomas had noted it as a possible line camp location if he ever ran cattle that high. He had never run cattle that high. Lenora had filed the location the same way she filed everything Thomas showed her about the land, not as a curiosity, but as inventory, stored against future use in the part of her mind where practical information lived and did not go stale. The cave was 4 miles northeast. The sky above the Absaroka was darkening at the edges the way sky darkens when the pressure system behind it means what it says. She had perhaps 6 hours of usable light. She adjusted the cast iron pot against her hip, shifted the rolled blanket on her back, and walked faster. The temperature dropped 3 degrees in the next hour. She felt it on her face first, the particular sharpening of cold air that happens when wind begins to move at altitude, dragging high country air down the ridge, faces toward the basin. By the time she reached the base of the cliff above Needle Creek, the first snow was falling, light and exploratory, the advanced scouts of what was building behind it. She found the ledge traverse and started up. The ledge was 18 inches wide at its narrowest point. Lenora had traversed it once before, in July, in daylight, wearing soft-soled moccasins and carrying nothing heavier than a canteen. She traversed it now in October dark, with a cast-iron pot swinging from her left hip, a rolled blanket across her back, shifting her center of gravity rearward, a hatchet in her right hand, and the first serious snow of the season coming off the cliff face in diagonal sheets that reduced visibility to the length of her outstretched arm. She kept her left shoulder pressed against the rock face and moved in 4-inch increments, right foot finding purchase, left foot following, the cast iron pot clanging once against the cliff wall with a sound that seemed enormous in the dark. She reached the alcove opening in 11 minutes. The space inside was larger than memory had rendered it, 12 feet deep, 8 feet across at the widest, the ceiling varying from 4 feet at the back to nearly 6 at the mouth, where the sandstone plates had separated along their natural joint. The floor was dry sand and pulverized rock, pale and fine-grained, unmarked by animal sign, except for a scattering of old bird droppings near the entrance that told her the space had been unoccupied long enough for whatever had used it to have moved on entirely. The north and west walls were solid cliff face. The opening faced south-southeast, sheltered by a natural rock overhang that projected 18 inches above the entrance and would shed snow away from the interior. She set the cast iron pot down and the hatchet beside it and stood in the cave mouth looking out at the storm for a full minute, reading it the way 6 years in the Absaroka had taught her to read weather. Not for what it was doing now, but for what the behavior of the snow and the sound of the wind suggested it intended to do next. The flakes were still small and dry, the kind that came ahead of the main system, and the wind was consistent from the northwest rather than gusting, which meant the front was organized and moving at a steady pace rather than stalled. It would snow through the night and likely through the following day. It would not be the last storm of the season. She turned back to the cave and began to work. The first priority was heat, and the first problem was fuel. The ledge traverse made bringing wood from the tree line a slow proposition. 1 trip at a time, both hands needed for balance on the narrow shelf, and the storm was moving faster than she wanted. She made 3 trips to the nearest lodgepole stand before the snow on the ledge accumulated enough to make the footing uncertain. Carrying as much as she could hold across her forearms each time, stacking the wood against the cave's back wall, where the overhang kept the worst of the moisture off it. The third trip, she added a double armload of dead branches and pine duff from beneath the trees, dry material that had been sheltered under the canopy and would serve for tinder and small fire kindling. 14 pieces of firewood, not enough for more than 2 days of careful burning. She noted this and kept moving. Fire placement was the next decision, and it required more thought than it might have in a standard shelter, because the cave's sandstone composition changed the risk calculus. Sandstone contained moisture in its grain structure that could, under sustained direct heat, expand rapidly enough to fracture the rock and send fragments at dangerous velocity. Thomas had told her this, specifically, the day they found the cave. He had pointed at the back wall and said, "Never build a fire against sandstone you haven't tested, because the rock will tell you what it thinks about fire in ways you won't enjoy." She built the fire pit at the cave's center, 3 feet from any wall, using flat creek stones she carried up from the Needle Creek bank on her first wood-gathering trip, setting them in a tight circle 6 inches high that would contain the coals and reflect heat outward without concentrating it against the cave walls. She had the fire going in 7 minutes, flint against steel into a nest of pine duff tinder, the spark catching on the third strike and blossoming into a small, steady flame she fed with finger-thick twigs before graduating to wrist-sized pieces. She set the cast-iron pot on 2 of the flat stones above the coals and packed it with snow scraped from just outside the cave entrance, letting it melt slowly for drinking water while she addressed the floor. The sand was dry but cold and would conduct body heat away from anyone sleeping on it, with the efficiency of a material that has no investment in the comfort of the person above it. She gathered pine boughs on her last safe traverse of the ledge, moving by feel more than sight in the thickening dark, snapping branches from the lower lodgepole limbs, and laid them in an overlapping layer 2 feet thick across the back half of the cave floor. The cut ends pointed away from the sleeping surface, the needle-covered branches layered like shingles to create a surface that was compressible and insulating and would hold body warmth in the air pockets between the needles rather than letting it bleed down into the sand. She unrolled the wool blanket over the pine bough bed and sat on it and ate a small handful of the dried corn raw, not because she preferred it that way, but because cooking required fuel she needed to conserve, and raw corn in the stomach produced heat through digestion that cooked corn did not. She had read this in a trapper's account published in a Cheyenne newspaper 2 winters prior, and had stored it without knowing why. The fire settled into a steady low burn. The cave temperature, which had been identical to the outside air when she arrived, had climbed to something she estimated at 30 degrees above ambient. Not warm. Survivable. The distinction she had been working toward since the moment Patch came through the tree line without Thomas on his back. Outside, the storm pressed against the Absaroka Range with the full weight of what it had been building toward all day. The snow came off the cliff face in curtains now, thick and purposeful, piling in the shelter of the overhang without reaching the cave mouth. Lenora added 2 pieces of wood to the fire, adjusted her position against the back wall, pulled the wool blanket to her chin, and looked at the ceiling of the cave that was going to have to become something more than a cave before this winter was finished. She had 14 pieces of wood, 11 rounds in the revolver, a coil of snare wire, a partial sack of salt, a tin of lard, and everything she had learned about the Absaroka Range in 6 years of paying close attention. She started making a list in her head of what else she needed and how she was going to get it. The storm ran 4 days. Lenora knew this not by counting, but by the wood. She had started with 14 pieces and ended with 3 when the snow finally stopped and the wind dropped and the light coming through the cave mouth shifted from the flat gray of storm light to the sharper pale blue of clear, cold sky. 4 days on 14 pieces of lodgepole pine meant she had burned at a rate that kept her alive without keeping her comfortable, and the distinction between those two things had occupied most of her waking hours during those 4 days, in the specific way that cold occupies a person's attention when there is not quite enough heat to stop thinking about it. She climbed down the ledge on the morning of the 5th day and stood in the snow at the base of the cliff and looked at what the storm had delivered. 2 feet on the flat, more in the drifts, the Needle Creek drainage buried to the tops of the lower shrubs, with only the lodgepole crowns showing above the white. The creek itself was audible beneath its ice skin, a low, intermittent creek that meant water still moved in the deep channel, which meant she had a water source that would not require melting snow indefinitely. She spent that day on logistics. 3 trips up the ledge with firewood, as much as she could carry each time, stacking it against the back wall until she had what she estimated was a 10-day supply at careful burn rates. On the 4th trip, she brought the snare wire and the hatchet and a coil of the rope she had used to tie her blanket roll, and she spent the afternoon setting 6 snares in the rabbit runs she had identified in the lodgepole stand below the cliff. The runs were packed channels in the snow surface worn by repeated passage, the tracks clear in the fresh snow, rear feet printing ahead of the front in the bounding pattern that meant snowshoe hare, the dominant small game in the Absaroka at this elevation. She caught 2 hares on the 2nd morning. She caught 1 or 2 on most subsequent mornings through November, enough to supplement the dried corn and keep her protein intake at a level that maintained her working capacity without depleting the corn reserve faster than she could justify. She cooked everything in the cast iron pot over the fire pit, boiling the hare meat long enough to pull from the bone, drinking the broth before eating the meat because the broth carried dissolved fat and minerals that the meat alone did not deliver, and because warmth in the stomach at altitude in October was not a luxury. The cave itself she improved across the first 2 weeks with the systematic attention of a woman who had decided she was going to be in this space for 5 months and intended to be competent in it, rather than merely surviving it. She widened the fire pit ring to accommodate larger pieces and reconfigured the stone arrangement to create a better reflective surface that directed more heat toward the sleeping area at the back. She gathered additional pine boughs and rebuilt the floor bed to 3 feet of compressed depth, enough that the cold from the sand below could not conduct through it, regardless of the outside temperature. She cut lodgepole saplings with the hatchet and lashed them horizontally across the cave mouth at waist height, using strips cut from the hem of her inner dress, creating a windbreak frame that she wove with pine branches to block the direct wind without cutting the draft that the fire needed to burn cleanly. The windbreak changed the cave's livability more than anything else she built. Before it, the fire burned unevenly, pulled sideways by wind off the cliff face, producing more smoke than heat when the gusts came through. After it, the fire burned straight and steady, and the cave held its temperature through the night, with 2 pieces of wood banked at bedtime instead of the 3 she had been burning before. She extended the windbreak in November, adding a 2nd layer of woven branches and packing the gaps with pine duff that compressed into a dense mat under the pressure of her hands. By December, the cave mouth was effectively sealed against wind, while maintaining enough gap at the top for smoke to exit. A draft management solution she arrived at through 6 consecutive evenings of adjustment, testing each configuration by watching how the smoke moved and modifying what she had built until the smoke went where she needed it to go and stayed there. December brought the cold that October had only suggested. The temperature at the Absaroka cave dropped to what she estimated was -18 on the worst nights, a figure she calibrated against the behavior of the water in the cast iron pot, which froze solid in under an hour when she set it outside the windbreak at night and took 4 hours to melt completely when she brought it back to the fire. She had no thermometer. She had observation and inference and 6 years of Wyoming winter experience, and those tools gave her numbers accurate enough to work with. She did not freeze. She came close twice, once in a mid-December night, when the fire burned lower than she intended while she slept, and she woke to a cave temperature that had her shaking before she was fully conscious. And once in January, when a 3-day storm pinned her in the cave without the ability to gather wood, and she burned the pine bough bed layer by layer to maintain heat, rebuilding it on the 4th day when the storm broke. Both times she recovered. Both times she noted what had gone wrong and changed what needed changing. The snares kept producing through January. The hares were thinner by then, their fat reserves depleted by the hard winter, and the meat was leaner and provided less caloric return per animal than it had in October. She compensated by using the lard more deliberately, a small amount rendered into each pot of broth, the fat calories offsetting what the lean meat did not provide. The lard tin was 3/4 empty by February. She rationed the remainder in portions she calculated would carry her to March, when the snowshoe hare population began its spring recovery and the meat would fatten again. She kept a calendar on the cave wall, not with any tool she had brought. With the skinning knife blade drawn lightly across the sandstone surface, a single vertical scratch for each day, grouped in 7s, starting from the morning she had climbed the ledge in the October storm. By the end of February, she had 127 scratches on the wall above the sleeping area, and she ran her finger across them some mornings, the way a person runs a finger across something they need to confirm is real. The trapper found her in the first week of March. His name was Aldous Peck, out of the Shoshone River country, working his upper line in the first break of decent weather the Absaroka had offered in 6 weeks. He came up Needle Creek on snowshoes and smelled the wood smoke before he saw the cave, and he stood at the base of the cliff for a long moment, looking at the smoke coming from the rock face above him, before he called up and asked if someone was there. Lenora looked over the windbreak at a man standing in the snow below with a pack frame and a weathered face, and the expression of someone who has encountered something unexpected and is deciding how to respond to it. She told him she was there. He asked if she needed help. She considered the question with the careful honesty of a woman who had been answering it privately for 5 months, and said she needed news from below and a bag of cornmeal if he had one to spare, and information about whether Clem Crane was still on the claim 6 miles south of the Needle Creek drainage. Peck said Clem Crane had abandoned the claim in November and ridden south to Laramie, and as far as anyone along the Shoshone knew, had not come back. Lenora was quiet for a moment. Then she asked Peck if he wanted coffee. She said she had been saving the last of the ground beans for an occasion that justified them, and this seemed close enough. Peck climbed the ledge and ducked through the windbreak and stood in the cave looking at the fire pit and the stacked wood and the calendar scratched into the sandstone wall and the pine bough bed rebuilt after January's burning, and the 6 snare loops hanging from the lashed sapling crossbar drying after the morning's reset. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said he had been trapping the Absaroka for 11 years and he had never seen a line camp set up this well. Lenora put the coffee on to boil and said it was not a line camp. She said it was a home. She said there was a difference, and she had learned it somewhere around the end of November. Peck drank his coffee and looked at the 127 marks on the wall and did not argue the point.